Welcome to part 2 of the two-part series about the might of Germany's U-boats during World War II. In part 1, we gave insight into just how dominant the German submarines were in the famous Battle of the Atlantic. We also covered how neither Britain nor America had an answer for the infamous U-boat wolfpacks in the first 3 years of the war. In this video, we'll see how the Allies turned the tide on the iconic U-boats, ensuring not only Allied victory in the Atlantic but, to some extent, ultimate victory in World War II itself. After all the delays and scores of ships and lives lost, the Allied response to the U-boat scourge boiled down to one principal factor: technology. And if there's one thing that the Second World War did more to advance than any other single conflict, it was technology. One key technology that the Germans had, which gave them a huge strategic advantage over the Allies, was their famous Enigma machines. The Enigma machine, with its rotors and accompanying code books, was at the cutting edge of cryptography in the 1940s. The British were eventually lucky enough to capture an Enigma machine and able to decipher it, but the Germans soon changed the machine. For 10 months, there was nothing the British could do to crack the new Enigma, and then they captured another machine and, once again, could decipher it. Cracking the Enigma was especially important in giving the Allied High Command first-hand knowledge of U-boat wolfpack schedules. This allowed the Allies to reschedule and reorganize shipping convoys in order to avoid wolfpacks, which until 1943 had proven devastating in their ability to hunt down and sink Allied ships in waves of attacks from all directions. In the meantime, the Germans had cracked the British Naval Code, which allowed them to intercept British naval operations. However, once the Enigma had been cracked for a final time, the British maintained the upper hand from which the Germans never fully recovered, in particular, their U-boat and Allied naval operations. And then there was the advent of modern radar. Allied shipping, particularly in the Atlantic, had been thwarted in the early years because their sonar wasn't a match for German U-boats. As covered in the first video of this series, U-boats were able to attack undetected by doing so at the surface and especially at night. Outdated sonar technology simply didn't allow U-boats to be detected above surface. The Allies would eventually employ radar on their ships, which could detect the conning towers of U-boats from miles away. It took months and many downed U-boats before the German High Command established that radar on Allied ships was allowing them to detect U-boats skimming the surface. To counter Allied radar technology, the Germans used their Metox radar detector, which allowed U-boats enough warning time to dive before Allied surface vessels could intercept them. But the Allies had even more at their disposal in the form of radio direction tracking devices, which were dubbed bird cages. They used these to determine U-boat locations, and they proved invaluable to convoys. The Allies also made use of lights, or more specifically, the ley light. This type of spotlight was attached to naval aircraft such as the B-24 or Liberator as it was known. A powerful ley light could illuminate entire areas of ocean surface at night in order to reveal any U-boats that could be lurking at or just below the surface. The B-24 quickly became known to its British and American pilots as the U-boat killer. The Allies also developed a munition that was far more effective than any depth charge. It was called the Hedgehog and was a forward-firing mortar that lobbed contact-fused bombs into the water ahead of a ship, while a U-boat target was still within sonar range. So, what were ultimately the leading reasons for the eventual defeat of the U-boats and Germany's Kriegsmarine in the Battle of the Atlantic? There were many reasons, most of which we've covered to some extent in this video. According to most World War II historians, the leading reasons for the eventual failure of the Germans were down to both improvements made by the Allies and mistakes made by the Germans. On the Allied side, there were marked and often groundbreaking improvements in their available technology, including the deployment of advanced radar systems on Allied shipping crossing the Atlantic. Technologies such as the Hedgehog, the birdcage, and the ley light all played an important role too. Cracking the Enigma not once but multiple times was also critically important for the Allies, and the British in particular. From 1943 onwards, the Allies also made extensive use of naval aircraft, such as the aforementioned and highly effective B-24s or Liberators. They proved a nightmare for U-boats throughout the Atlantic, and in other bodies of water too. As for the Germans, they made a litany of errors that eventually caught up with them, and in particular, their all-important U-boats. They had failed to upgrade the technology available on U-boats, which made them unwieldy and clunky by the end of the war when compared to swifter, more advanced Allied subs. U-boats also suffered from limited torpedo capacity, which the Germans never rectified. The Germans had also suffered from an over-reliance on their Enigma machines. Once they were cracked, the Kriegsmarine never recovered. The British had also benefited from America's Lend-Lease program, which enabled the Royal Navy to buy both warships and merchant ships from the U.S., even at a time when the United States was not technically at war. Furthermore, Canada was able to build smaller vessels such as minesweepers and corvettes in their shipyards on the St. Lawrence River. Later in the war, most Atlantic convoys would be escorted by minesweepers and corvettes of the Royal Canadian Navy. These smaller, more nimble warships became very good at chasing down, intercepting, and destroying U-boats. One cannot underestimate how important it was that the U-boat threat was neutralized in the Atlantic. This was evident by the time of the Normandy D-Day landings in June 1944, whereby a neutralized U-boat threat allowed Allied navies to concentrate their resources more effectively on the landings. There are even those that speculate that, had the Allies not been able to overturn or at least neutralize the U-boat threat in the Atlantic, the war could have been very different. Allied navies would not have been as able to focus on the landings if their convoys were still being heavily battered in the Atlantic. This may have allowed the Germans to be better positioned to counter the Normandy landings and, in particular, Allied naval operations during the landings. In turn, this could have even freed up the Western Front for Germany, allowing Hitler to free up more troops and equipment to fight against Soviet advances on the Eastern Front. A pivotal period in the Battle of the Atlantic was undoubtedly the month of May 1943, in what would become known as Black May for Germany's U-boat division. It marked the time in which the number of U-boats sunk increased, while the number of Allied ships sunk by U-boats decreased. In May 1943, there were 240 operational U-boats in service, of which 118 were at sea. However, in just that 1 month of May 1943, no less than 41 U-boats were destroyed, which was roughly 25% of operational U-boats. Allied escorts, now armed with more sophisticated technology, had also become far more strategically savvy. 3 Allied convoys in that month saw the loss of 7 Allied ships but also 7 U-boats. Those types of statistics were unthinkable a mere year earlier when U-boats were decimating Allied ships in their scores. Allied convoy SC-130 could be considered the real turning point in the battle between U-boats and convoy escorts. In that milestone convoy, 5 U-boats were sunk while not a single convoy ship was lost. Among the U-boat dead was Peter Dönitz on U-954, who was the son of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the iconic head of Germany's U-boat division. There's something very symbolic about the son of the U-boat division being killed in the very convoy that can be marked as the turning point of the Allies beating the once unbeatable U-boats. Karl Dönitz was so shocked by the turn of events that took place during May 1943 that he ordered a temporary halt to the U-boat campaign on May 24, 1943. The U-boats only returned to the Atlantic in significant numbers in the autumn of that year, but they never regained the advantage. Their supremacy was over. Speaking of Karl Dönitz, at the start of the war, he had insisted that 300 U-boats would have been enough to defeat the British in the Atlantic. Hitler had refused his request as he was more enamored of large capital ships. It's well known that Dönitz was humiliated by Hitler's denial of his request, even if he loyally accepted his Führer's choice. However, many historians have speculated that Karl Dönitz may have had a valid strategic point. They contend that 300 U-boats right at the start of the war may have indeed overwhelmed British convoys far more quickly and maybe even irrevocably. After all, Winston Churchill would famously later note that, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." In the end, Germany's U-boats were not the decisive factor in the war, and they certainly didn't help Germany win the war. But the legendary German submarines may have come a lot closer in doing so than many people realize.